If you're studying philosophy and ethics, then subscribe. I'm covering the entire series in this channel. In the previous lecture, we built the entire theoretical framework of Kantian ethics. You now understand where Kant came from, what the good will is, why acting from duty matters, what hypothetical and categorical imperatives are, and how the three formulations of the categorical imperative work. But knowing a theory and being able to use it are two different things entirely. So this lecture is about application. We're going to take Kant's three formulations, the formula of universal law, the formula of humanity, and the formula of the kingdom of ends, and use them as analytical tools on three classic moral cases that appear repeatedly in exam questions across OCR, AQA, and Edexcel. And by the end, you will be able to do something that separates good essays from outstanding essays. Not just explain what the categorical imperative is, but actually apply it, reach a verdict, evaluate that verdict, and then compare it with other theories in a single coherent paragraph. The three cases are lying, promise breaking, and treating persons as ends. Each one is a genuine philosophical puzzle. Each one reveals something important about the power and the limits of Kantian ethics. Before we get to the cases, let us be clear about what examiners are actually looking for when they set questions on Kantian ethics. Knowing the formulations is necessary, but it's not sufficient. A student who can define the formula of universal law accurately is operating at AO1. A student who can take a specific moral case, apply that formulation methodically to it, and reach a clear argued verdict is operating at AO2. And AO2 is where the majority of marks live across all three boards. Now, this is the examiner's expectation. Deploy the theory. Don't describe it from the outside, but use it from the inside. As a working moral framework, apply it to a real case. The structure of a Kantian analysis is always three steps, and you should apply them in this order every time. Step 1, identify the maxim. What principle is the agent acting on? State it precisely. Not just lying, but I will lie when it benefits me. The specific formulation matters because it determines what happens when you universalize it. Step 2, test through each formulation. Apply the formula of universal law. Apply the formula of humanity. If the case warrants it, apply the formula of the kingdom of ends. Work through each one systematically. And then step 3, reach a moral verdict. Kant's ethics are designed to produce clear, unconditional answers. State the verdict explicitly. Do not hedge. Do not say, it depends. Kantian ethics says it does not depend. State the conclusion and explain which formulation drives it. And remember, because it is one, here you're going to find something that is one of the most important things to understand about Kantian ethics. The three formulations are not three separate theories that might produce different results. They're three lenses on the same underlying principle. A maxim that fails one will generally fail all three. Use all three in strong essays. Here is the case for the puzzle of lying. A close friend is hiding in your house. A murderer knocks at your door and demands to know where they are. Is it permissible to lie? Before I give you Kant's answer, I want you to sit with this question by yourself honestly. What is your intuition? Almost everyone, when they first encounter this case, feel that lying is not just permissible, but it's morally required. Your friend's life is at stake. The murderer has no right to the information, and telling the truth would simply be catastrophic. And then Kant's framework produces a conclusion that shocks almost every person who encounters it for the first time. But before we get to that, why is this case philosophically useful? Well, because it's designed to expose the tension between deontological reasoning and consequentialist reasoning at its sharpest. It forces you to ask, does morality depend on what reason commands, regardless of consequences, or does it depend on what consequences we produce? And that question is at the heart of the entire ethics course. But hold your intuition. We're about to test it against one of the most demanding moral frameworks ever constructed. Lying, the Kantian verdict. So let us apply the two formulations here. The formula of universal law. So you identify the maxim. I will lie when it benefits me. Now universalize it. If everyone acted on this principle, if lying whenever convenient became a universal law, what would happen? Well, the institution of communication and truth-telling, on which the very practice of lying parasitically depends, would collapse. No one would believe any assertion made. Trust would cease to exist. The maxim is self-defeating when universalized. It destroys the very practice it relies on. Therefore, lying violates a perfect duty and is absolutely impermissible. And then there's the formula of humanity. When you lie to someone, you deny them rational information that they need to make autonomous decisions. You treat them as a mere means, a tool to be manipulated for your own purposes, rather than as a rational agent capable of responding to truth. Even the murderer at the door, as a rational being, is being treated merely as a means if you lie to him. And here is Kant's conclusion that troubles most people. Even lying to the murderer who wants to kill your friend is impermissible. The wrongness of the lie is absolute. Its consequences do not alter its moral status. So why does Kant hold this? Because for him, consequences are not the domain of moral evaluation. The moral worth of an action is determined by the principle on which it is performed. And lie to protect someone cannot be universalized without contradiction. And this is the case that most powerfully exposes the internal logic and the genuine limits of Kantian ethics. For your essay purposes, it is a gift. It generates the most productive comparative discussions with both situation ethics, which would permit the lie in the name of agape, and utilitarianism, which would calculate that the lie produces better consequences and is therefore right. And this is the case that most powerfully exposes both the internal logic and the genuine limits of Kantian ethics. Using lying in your essays, for your essay purposes, is a gift. It generates the most productive comparative discussions with both situation ethics, which would permit to lie in the name of agape, and utilitarianism, which would calculate that the lie produces better consequences and is therefore right. And pause to take note of the key terminology so far. You would use language like perfect duty, self-defeating maxim, rational agency, autonomy. But you should avoid vague phrases like Kant would disapprove. Well, let's turn to case study 2, the puzzle of promise breaking. The second case. You made a promise to a friend, but keeping it would now cause serious harm to a third party. Is breaking the promise ever permissible? Now, this case is less dramatic than the murderer at the door, but philosophically more complex, because it introduces the problem of conflicting duties, which is one of the most serious weaknesses of Kantian ethics and one of the most frequently examined across all 3 exam boards. So again, apply the method. Formula of universal law. Identify the maxim. I will break promises when convenient. Now universalize it. If everyone broke promises whenever it suited them, the institution of promising would collapse entirely. A promise is only meaningful because there is a general expectation that it will be kept. If that expectation disappears, the concept of a promise simply becomes meaningless. The maxim is self-defeating. Breaking promises violates a perfect duty. Then apply the formula of humanity. When you make a promise you intend to break, you use the other person's trust as an instrument. You exploit their rational good faith, their reasonable expectation that you will keep your word, for your own purposes. You treat their trust as a means to your end rather than respecting their rational agency. So what is Kant's verdict? Breaking promises is impermissible, always. But wait, what if keeping the promise causes serious harm to someone else? What if two duties, keep your promise and prevent harm, directly conflict? And this is the problem that most powerfully exposes the limits of Kantian ethics, and it's the evaluation point that appears most consistently in mark schemes across all three exam boards. So for Kant, duties are absolute. He provides no hierarchy of duties, no mechanism for weighing one against the other when they collide. His framework gives you clear answers when you are applying a single maxim to a single situation. It gives you no guidance at all when two perfect duties conflict with each other. And this is a genuine philosophical weakness. It's not a minor quibble, but a structural problem with the very theory itself. The most important scholarly response to this problem comes from W.D. Ross, a British philosopher working in the early 20th century. Now, Ross introduced the concept of prima facie duties that are genuinely binding unless they are overridden by a stronger duty in a specific context. He acknowledges that we have multiple moral duties: to keep promises, to tell the truth, to prevent harm, to show gratitude, to be just. And in most situations, these duties align with each other. But when they conflict with each other, we must exercise careful moral reflection to identify which duty is the strongest in this particular case. Now, the duty that survives this reflection, Ross calls the actual duty, the thing we are genuinely required to do, all things considered. And this is a Kantian-influenced framework that admits moral complexity without abandoning the deontological commitment to its duty. It's the most philosophically sophisticated response to the problem of conflicting duties, and it is exactly the kind of nuanced evaluation that earns high marks in essays on all three exam boards. Then we turn to case study 3, treating persons as ends. So the third case study focuses entirely on the formula of humanity, because this is the formulation that generates the most powerful and practically useful analysis in your essays. Now, the formula states, act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never merely as a means. So let's apply it to 3 contemporary cases here that each illuminate a different aspect of what the formula prohibits. Let's start with the organ transplant dilemma. A surgeon has 5 patients dying from organ failure. A healthy patient arrives for a routine check. The surgeon could harvest this person's organs and save 5 lives. Now, the consequences favour the action. 5 lives saved, only 1 lost. So utilitarianism offers to endorse this. But the formula of humanity condemns it absolutely. The healthy patient is being used purely as a resource, a collection of organs, with no regard for their rational personhood. They are treated merely as a means. Kant categorically impermissible, regardless of consequences. What about exploitive working conditions? A company uses workers purely for economic output. Long hours, dangerous conditions, no regard for their well-being, dignity, or rational agency. Apply the formula of humanity and it condemns this absolutely. It doesn't matter what wages are paid, using human beings as instruments of production, ignoring their personhood, violates the fundamental requirement to treat persons always as ends in themselves. And finally, capital punishment. Now, this case is philosophically fascinating because Kant himself endorsed capital punishment. He argued that justice demands that a murderer face death as the appropriate retribution for their crime. But his own formula raises a serious question here. Does the state, in executing a condemned person as a deterrent to others, use that person merely as a means to public safety? Well, if so, it violates the formula of humanity, even by Kant's own standard. So, this internal tension in Kantian ethics is precisely the kind of evaluative point that signals sophisticated philosophical thinking to an examiner. So let's evaluate Kantian ethics through the cases. What do these three cases reveal about Kantian ethics as a whole? Let's consolidate the evaluation before we move on to some essay technique. Let's start with the strengths. The consistency of Kant's framework is genuinely impressive here. The same principle, the categorical imperative, applies to every person in every circumstance without any exception. There's no special pleading, no making exceptions for people you like, no calculating whether this particular lie produces a better consequence than that one over there. The moral law is universal and it applies to everyone. There's also the respect for persons built into the formula of humanity because it's really, really profound. Every rational agent is treated as having unconditional dignity that cannot be overridden by any calculation of utility. And this is what Kant's ethics gets right, that utilitarianism gets wrong. And it connects directly to the justice problem that we looked at in the utilitarian series. Its universality provides a clear and applicable test. You can take any maxim, ask whether it can be universalized, and get a principled answer. This is a more transparent and more consistent way than either situationist judgment or utilitarian calculation. But what are its weaknesses? Well, it's quite rigid. The rigidity of Kantian ethics is at its most serious practical weakness. The murderer at the door case produces a conclusion that the vast majority of people find not just counterintuitive, but morally unacceptable. A theory that cannot permit lying to save a life has something important missing from it. There's also the problem of conflicting duties that we've looked at, and this is more of a structural problem than incidental. Kant's framework simply has no mechanism for resolving the clashes between perfect duties, and real moral life presents many of those clashes constantly. And there's the apparent indifference to consequences troubles many thoughtful critics. A moral theory that tells you it is irrelevant whether your action produces suffering or flourishing strikes many people as morally incomplete. However internally consistent it might be. So remember, the formula of humanity is your most powerful tool in your essays. It generates the clearest philosophical contrast with consequentialist reasoning and directly addresses that justice problem in utilitarianism. Now let's turn everything we've covered into practical essay methods. The structure for a comparative paragraph using a Kantian case study has 4 moves. First, you need to state the Kantian verdict precisely. Something like, Kant holds that lying to the murderer at the door is impermissible because universalizing the maxim, I will lie when convenient, would undermine the institution of communication on which rational agency depends. Second, you need to identify the formulation used and explain why it produces this verdict. You might say something like this. The formula of universal law requires that any maxim be capable of being willed as a universal law without contradiction. The maxim of lying is self-defeating when universalized. It destroys the very practice it exploits. Third, you want to contrast with situation ethics or utilitarianism. You might say something like this. By contrast, Fletcher's situation ethics would permit the lie because agape, unconditional love for the friend, demands it. The situationist argues that no rule is absolute except love, and in this situation, love clearly requires deception. And fourth, you need to evaluate which position is more convincing and why. So you might say something like this. Kant's position has the virtue of principled consistency, but it appears to ignore a morally relevant consideration entirely. The friend's life matters. A theory that treats consequences as irrelevant to moral evaluation may be internally coherent, but fails to capture the full moral reality of the situation. Now, that four-move structure in a single paragraph is what level 4 and level 5 AO2 often looks like across the 3 exam boards. You also need to have essential terminology and use it precisely. Perfect duty, an absolute exceptionless obligation that cannot be overridden in any circumstance. Self-defeating maxim, a maxim that, when universalized, destroys the very practice on which it depends. Rational agency, the capacity to act on reason rather than instinct or inclination, which is the basis of Kantian moral worth. Autonomy, self-legislation, the rational will giving itself its own moral law. Prima facie duty, a duty that is genuinely binding unless overridden by a stronger duty in context. Mere means, treating a person solely as an instrument for another's ends, with no regard for their rational personhood. Kingdom of ends, the community of rational agents who treat each other always as an ends in themselves. And the AO2 move, don't just apply, but make sure you evaluate. Ask, does Kant's verdict here reflect a strength of principled consistency or an unacceptable indifference to human welfare? So you now have a complete working knowledge of Kantian ethics as a theoretical and applied framework. You know the historical context, the goodwill, the distinction between acting from duty and acting in accordance with duty, the 3 formulations, how to apply them to classic cases with comparative essay technique. Next, we're going to take the evaluation further, examining the most powerful criticisms of Kantian ethics from scholars including Bernard Williams, the demandingness objection, and the full AO2 essay scaffolding that will prepare you for the highest band answers across all 3 exam boards. But make sure before that time comes that you can do 3 things from memory. 1. State all 3 formulations precisely in your own words without looking at your notes. 2. Apply the formula of universal law to any maxim in 2 or 3 sentences. And 3. Write a comparative essay contrasting Kant's verdict on lying with Fletcher's situationist verdict using the 4-move structure from this lecture. If you can do those 3 things, you are operating at the level the examiner is looking for.